Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. Look, we know that these white supremacists like Dylan Roof and Payton Gendron and others, they're not working in a vacuum. They're being advised, counseled, and even directed by people in law enforcement. Because every time one of these anti-black race attacks occurs, it's always someone who has incestuous ties to the police, and other family members, no doubt. And with the Buffalo terrorist attack, we have another such instance. Credit to Brother Tariq for signal boosting this one. The FBI is looking into whether a federal agent, believed to be from Texas, was involved in the Buffalo terrorist attack. This retired agent was one of 6 people who were in regular, frequent contact with the terrorist Payton Gendron in an online chat room where racist hatred was discussed. I despise weasel words like that from the white media. These people weren't discussing race hatred, they were planning it. The feds are saying that this retired federal agent was one of the people who Gendron invited to read about his plans for the terrorist attack he carried out. So far, the white media is saying that they can't determine whether this retired agent accepted the invitation or not. Anyone really want to lay odds on that one? Now, when Brittany Drexel went missing, the FBI had no problem publicly naming Timothy Taylor, a black man, as a person of interest in this case. And this brought tons of death threats on Timothy Taylor and his family. His mother lost her job that she'd had for 11 years because of the FBI doing that. And after the killer was found, who turned out to be white, the FBI never apologized to Timothy Taylor and his family, never bothered to even say that Timothy Taylor was innocent. So they wanted to make sure that this accusation that they said 10 years ago hung over his head, a crime that he didn't commit. Meanwhile, there's no attempt being made to put any pressure on this retired racist agent or any of the other online members of this terrorist cell. No attempt to go over his entire service record to see if he was using his position to harm black people or not. The FBI said that the people in Gendron's chat group were regurgitating all the classic anti-black racist claptrap, and of course, none of these very fine people bothered to call the FBI to warn them about a terrorist attack that they knew was coming. 30 minutes before the attack, Gendron invited a small group into a private chat room on Discord so that they could look at his terrorist plans. 15 people accepted that invitation. They not only looked at his plans for the terrorist attack, but they also watched him live stream the attack as he carried it out. The federal authorities are allegedly investigating if this retired agent provided any information to Gendron before he carried out the attack. And it's being reported that they're also looking into the former agent's relationship to Gendron. Well, we already know he was involved in egging this inbred on. He most likely was the one who thought this up and drew up the plans for it. Gendron also was in contact with someone who he called Saint Sandman, who Gendron claimed advised him on the manufacturers of AR-15s and which one to buy. Could this be the retired federal agent? Now, the Buffalo News piece quotes a civil rights attorney as saying that it would be outrageous if it turned out former law enforcement had advance notice of the terrorist attack and did nothing to prevent it. Well, we know that it wouldn't be outrageous at all. Actually, it would be standard operating procedure for them. Most all anti-black race attacks in this country are carried out by the police. You can go back and look at the archives on this very YouTube channel and see my work documenting the draft riots during the Civil War. Irish-American police were leading the charge to target and kill black people simply for the crime of being black. And more recently, you had the case of the 3 civil rights workers, Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, who were murdered in Mississippi, murdered by sheriff's deputies. And these were not retired deputies either, they were active duty. You even had retired and active duty police who took part in the attack on the Capitol. In fact, you would be very hard-pressed to find any anti-black terrorist attack that didn't have the fingerprints of the police all over it. Of course they were involved in this attack in Buffalo. They've been involved in practically all the other race terrorist attacks. And here's another example for you. After Jamar Clark was murdered by the Minneapolis police, activists protested in front of the precinct where the police who murdered him operated out of. These activists were then attacked by gun-wielding white supremacists, not all of whom were white, might I add. The terrorists were users of the online forum 4chan, and they posted videos of themselves bragging about how they were going to carry out their attack. But as those of you who have heard me tell this story in the past know, those young activists, they were also monitoring these online chat rooms where these white supremacist terrorists were hanging out at, and they could see what was coming and they were ready for it. Those young black activists, they put their heads together and they organized and they kept an eye out for these terrorists when they showed up. They surrounded and engaged the terrorists, and I mean for real engaged, not phony engaged like the Texas police tried to claim they did in Uvalde. And of course, being white supremacists, these terrorists fled, but as they did so, they fired into the crowd. The person who the white media and the white authorities try to make out as being the sole individual responsible for the attack is Lawrence Scarcella, because he shot 5 people during this terrorist action. 5 people he shot and tried to kill. He's a mass shooter, but the white media never called it a mass shooting, and neither did the government. They never called it a terrorist attack either, even though that's exactly what it was, an armed attack meant to scare black people. The Minneapolis terrorist attack doesn't get mentioned by the white media, but I make it a point to bring it up whenever I can because those terrorists had direct links to the police. In the hours directly following the attack, Scarcella called a cop who was an old high school friend. Now initially, this old friend was only reported on in the white media as being named Levin. And this Officer Levin was the very first person who the terrorist Scarcella thought to call right after the police raided his home. Nobody bothered to ask what this Officer Levin knew and when he knew it, and of course you can already guess why. Because you won't be surprised to learn that Officer Levin, whose name is Brett Levin, resigned from the Burnsville Police Department shortly after this story came to light. Former Officer Levin testified in the Scarcella trial under oath that he frequently received racist emails from Scarcella that were racially charged and negative about black people. Levin also testified that he replied to Scarcella's text with racist texts of his own about black people. And of course, the prosecutor, Mike Freeman, the same DA who refused to bring charges against George Floyd's murderers, he was also the DA who mishandled Scarcella's prosecution, so of course he made sure not to ask Levin any questions about the content of his texts. Now again, why would a DA who's prosecuting a mass shooter and who is questioning the person who the terrorists trusted most and who the terrorists contacted right after the attack not ask any questions about the kind of text that this terrorist friend was sending back and forth? It wasn't because Freeman didn't know. It's because he wanted to make sure that he kept as many race soldiers on the streets as possible. The white media initially reported that all 4 of the 4chan terrorists in Minneapolis were white, but as it turned out, at least one of them, Daniel Macy, is actually Asian. And there was also an arrest made of a 5th terrorist cell member. One of the 4chan terrorist accomplices was a white Latino named Julio Suarez, who allegedly is in the Marines. Suarez was the one most responsible for the attack, as it turned out. He took part in helping Scarcella and his terrorist cell harass the protesters in Minneapolis just 2 days before the attack. Suarez also testified that he was the one who put Scarcella up to carrying out the attack. So this Suarez character was the one who thought it up. By the way, Suarez is the one who recorded that video of himself and Scarcella in the car while Suarez holds up the gun. He's the guy wearing glasses. Suarez ended that little video saying, "Stay white." That was a video that they recorded just before they carried out the attack. This Suarez creep was the one who was most responsible for that terrorist attack in Minneapolis. So naturally, DA Mike Freeman didn't bring any charges against Suarez because, as Freeman put it, Suarez wasn't present at the terrorist attack, so he didn't feel like there was anything he could charge him with. Suarez knew the attack was coming. He planned the attack. He brandished weapons, promising they would force the protesters to disperse. He was neck deep in it. Of course, as we all know, the only ones who dispersed were Scarcella and his terrorists. So this one backfired badly on them. But there's no excuse for Suarez not having been charged and prosecuted. If Suarez had been black, the DA would have been invoking the all-in laws in Minnesota, and Suarez would be in prison for being part of a gang. But of course, that racist DA Freeman, he's part of the irregular forces of white supremacy himself. After those black protesters disrupted that terrorist attack, Freeman understood that the terrorist attack had been blown, and it was now his job to limit how many race soldiers were being taken out of action. We'll continue with the moment of truth in just a moment, but first, a word from the official sponsor of Black Empowerment, Power Tools. There's no telling when something's going to come up, so make sure you carry your power tools at all times. You never know when you're going to need to bring the hammer down, or when you'll have some trash that needs to be blown away, or some obstacle that requires cutting down. Don't get caught empty-handed. Keep your hammer close by. Keep that leaf blower at the ready, and always carry your steel. Power Tools, because no matter what your day job or side hustle may be, there's no excuse for not being ready to put in some work. Now, as blatantly reprehensible as Mike Freeman's conduct was, the Obama administration was even more treacherous. The 4chan terrorist attack in Minneapolis was unquestionably a terrorist event. It happened in 2015, when Barack Obama was president, when the BLM movement was in full swing, and his administration never brought any federal charges against the 4chan terrorist in Minneapolis. Because Obama, seeing that next year was an election year, he didn't want to be seen as being hard on white supremacists, especially with Hillary trying to appeal to all of the, as she put it, hard-working white people whose vote she wanted. Now you see why I brought up how the FBI tried to frame Timothy Taylor. That attempted railroading happened in August 2016. So it was the Obama administration, with the Department of Injustice led by Loretta Lynch, who were trying to railroad an innocent black man and even his own father. Obama's DOJ had no problem throwing frivolous charges at a black man in the hopes of forcing him to cop to something he didn't even do. But when it comes to race terrorists who attack black people, Obama and his DOJ were MIA. So as you see, these cases prove as loudly as anything that the police are deeply involved whenever one of these anti-black race attacks occurs. This is why the authorities always say, practically before they even arrest the shooter, that they're not looking at anyone else. Doesn't matter how many people they've been talking to online, doesn't matter how many people they've been talking to offline, doesn't matter how many people have mentioned them. They never are interested in anyone else. They make sure, well, we're just limited to this one guy. No one else is involved. Because the police are the ones involved in these race attacks. There are plenty of others, of course. Kenneth Gleason in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where Alton Sterling was murdered. Gleason, like all the other white supremacists, carried out a cowardly ambush on 2 black men. The police actually let him go at first, hoping that he would take the hint and blow town before black people knew that he was out, but the police's plan failed and he wound up having to be rearrested and charged. He's now serving life in prison for those murders. It's long been said, though, by black residents down there that the police in Baton Rouge were directly responsible for Gleason's race attacks, that Gleason was working hand in hand with the police there, that this was either some sort of half-brained reprisal for what they accused Gavin Long of, or it was an attempt to double down on the murders of black people to show that just because people called them out on Alton Sterling's murder, well, that wasn't going to change anything. In either case, only a fool would rule out the police's involvement, since they're involved in so many other of these race attacks. So, as black people have said all along, these are not just random attacks by some random half-cocked racist. These are terrorist actions being carried out with the full knowledge of, and in many cases, direct coordination by law enforcement. And it's not some odd or rare occurrence. This is what they do, what they've always done. There's a long-standing track record of this. These race terrorists wouldn't be able to operate if they didn't have dedicated direct assistance and support from the police, from their cop friends online to the DA's offices all the way to the judge's chambers. These terrorists are the irregular forces of white supremacy. And when you look at how consistently there's always police involvement when they carry out an attack, and how the DAs and judges always give them a pass, you understand that these so-called law enforcement people are acting as support personnel for these race soldiers, no different than command and control in the military. Well, we have a right to protect ourselves, our loved ones, and our community. Right now, there are more anti-black race attacks being planned online and offline. The same government who was forced to admit that the white supremacists are the greatest national security threat to this country, they're not devoting resources to tracking down the white supremacists. They're not saying, hey, we did it to ISIS, it was good enough for Al-Qaeda, it's good enough for these white supremacists. They're not doing that at all. And it's obvious why. A hell of a lot of these federal agents are white supremacists themselves. As black people, we have to understand that it's going to be our responsibility to protect ourselves from these white supremacist race attacks, because you got people in government helping to carry them out. We have to be ready to stop these attacks and to make sure these terrorist cells are identified and located. Because if the 4chan attack in Minneapolis should have taught us anything, it's that it's only when black people play offense that we win. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Jacques Hargett, Anthony Cooper, Antonio Daniels, Eve, and Christopher Ellis. Salute to them, and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.